They threw their own father out on Thanksgiving night, but by morning, everything they owned was gone. What happened in those 12 hours will shock you. My name is Richard Hale. I'm 63 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I believed I understood the meaning of family. I believed that no matter how far people drifted, no matter how many arguments or misunderstandings happened over the years, there was always something that brought you back together. For us, that something was Thanksgiving. Every year, without fail, we gathered around the same table. The same long oak table I had bought decades ago when my children were still small enough to sit on booster seats and argue over who got the bigger slice of pie. Back then, the house was loud, messy, alive. It was full of laughter that echoed through the walls and warmth that didn't come from the fireplace. That morning, I woke up early, just like I always did. Old habits don't fade easily. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could hear soft footsteps upstairs, Melissa moving around, probably getting ready for the day. The smell of coffee hadn't filled the kitchen yet, so I made my own. I stood there by the counter, watching the steam rise from the mug, feeling something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't loneliness. It was something in between, like standing in a room where you used to belong but somehow didn't anymore. I shook it off. It was Thanksgiving. A day for gratitude. A day for family. That's what I told myself as I took a sip of my coffee and looked around the kitchen. Things had changed. The walls were repainted a shade of gray I didn't recognize. The cabinets I had installed myself were still there, but the handles had been replaced with something more modern. Even the table felt different, though I knew it was the same one. It wasn't mine anymore. Not really. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. "Morning, Dad," Daniel said, his voice flat, distracted. I turned and smiled. "Morning, son." He didn't look at me for long. Just a quick glance before heading to the fridge. He opened it, stared inside like he was searching for something important, then closed it again. "You sleep okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said shortly. That was it. No conversation. No warmth. Just words. Melissa came in a few minutes later. She was already dressed, her expression focused like she had a list of things to get through. "Richard," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "We're going to need the kitchen soon." I nodded. Of course. I was just finishing up. I took my mug and moved out of the way. It was a small thing, but it felt like a signal. Like I was being gently pushed aside in a space I once owned completely. As the morning went on, the house slowly filled with the sounds of preparation. Pots clanging, oven doors opening and closing, low conversations that stopped when I walked too close. I tried to help at first. I really did. "Need me to peel potatoes?" I asked. Melissa shook her head without looking at me. "I've got it." "I can set the table," I offered. "It's already handled." Every offer I made was quietly declined. So I stepped back. I sat in the living room, flipping through channels without actually watching anything. The television became background She gestured to a chair near the far end of the table. You can sit there. There. Not here. Not at the head. At the end. It was a small thing. Anyone else might have laughed it off, taking the seat without a second thought. But to me, it felt like something had been taken. Still, I nodded. Of course. I walked over and sat down. The chair felt colder somehow. Or maybe that was just me. Dinner started with the usual routine. Passing dishes, polite conversation, the clinking of cutlery against plates. People laughed. Stories were shared. But I noticed something. No one spoke to me directly. Not really. I tried to join in once or twice. That reminds me of when Daniel was a kid, I started. But someone else jumped in before I could finish, steering the conversation in a different direction. I smiled and leaned back. It's fine, I told myself. Just enjoy the moment. But the moment didn't feel like mine anymore. As the meal went on, I caught pieces of conversation that didn't sit right. The paperwork is done. It's all in place now. No more delays. I glanced at Daniel, but he avoided my eyes. What paperwork? I asked casually. The table went quiet for a second. Then Melissa smiled, too quickly. Oh, just some business stuff. Business stuff. That was all. Something in my chest tightened, but I didn't push further. Not yet. Dessert came and went. The plates were cleared. People moved into the living room, some with coffee, others with wine. I stayed at the table for a moment longer, staring at the empty plates, the crumbs, the remains of what was supposed to be a perfect evening. And that's when Daniel spoke. Dad, he said from behind me. Can we talk? I turned slowly. Of course. There was something in his voice. Something serious. We stepped into the hallway, away from the others. The laughter from the living room felt distant, almost unreal. What's going on? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had when he was nervous. I had seen it 1,000 times before. Dad. I need you to listen, he said finally. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I'm listening. He took a deep breath. You can't stay here anymore. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I'm sorry, what? You need to move out, he said, his voice steadier now. Tonight. Tonight. The word echoed in my head. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. That's not funny, Daniel. I'm not joking. I looked at him, really looked at him. And I realized something that made my chest feel hollow. He meant it. Where is this coming from? I asked, my voice quieter now. Melissa stepped into the hallway, standing beside him. It's time, Richard, she said. This arrangement isn't working anymore. Arrangement. That's what they called it. Living in my own house was an arrangement. I don't understand, I said. This is my home. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. Not anymore. The words hit harder than I expected. What do you mean, not anymore? The papers, he said. You signed them last year. The house I hadn't even noticed it before. I packed some of your things, she said. Of course she had. They had thought of everything. I took the bag without speaking. My hands felt steady, even though everything inside me was anything but. I walked to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. For a second, I thought about turning back. About arguing. About demanding answers. But I didn't. Because something inside me had already shifted. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, biting against my face. "Dad," Daniel said behind me. I paused, but I didn't turn around. "Happy Thanksgiving," Melissa added. I stepped outside. And then the door closed. Just like that. I stood there in the snow, the bag in my hand, the house behind me filled with light and laughter that no longer belonged to me. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just listened. To the wind. To the distant sound of voices inside. To the quiet realization settling deep in my bones. I had lost everything. Or at least, that's what they thought. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked at the house. At the windows glowing warm against the cold night. At the life I had built, now taken from me. And that's when I felt it. Not anger. Not grief. Something colder. Something sharper. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. They thought they could take everything, and I would simply disappear. I tightened my grip on the bag. And for the first time that night, I smiled. Because they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. And by morning, they were going to understand exactly who they had just thrown out into the cold. The cold followed me long after I left the house. It wasn't just the weather. It settled deeper than that, beneath my skin, inside my chest. The kind of cold that doesn't come from snow or wind, but from realization. I walked down the driveway slowly, each step steady, deliberate. Not because I knew where I was going, but because I refused to look lost. Behind me, through the glowing windows, I could still see movement. Shadows crossing the walls. People laughing. Glasses clinking. Life continued inside that house as if nothing had happened. As if I had never been there at all. I reached the sidewalk and stopped. For a moment, I considered turning back. Knocking on the door. Forcing a conversation they clearly didn't want to have. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew something had already ended. And whatever came next would not come from begging. I pulled my coat tighter around me and started walking. The streets were quiet, covered in a thin layer of fresh snow that softened every sound. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from distant chimneys. It reminded me of older Thanksgivings. Simpler ones. Back when Daniel was still a kid, running around the yard with a plastic football, shouting and laughing, asking me to play even when I was too tired from work. "Just 5 minutes, Dad." It was never just 5 minutes. I used to think those moments would last forever. I was wrong. I walked for nearly 20 minutes before I reached the main road. Cars passed occasionally, headlights slicing through the darkness, but none slowed down. I didn't try to stop them. I didn't need a ride. I needed time to think. Time to remember. Time to become something I hadn't been in a long while. but because of something far more personal. I reached my office door and stopped. The nameplate was still there. Richard Hale. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling a strange mix of emotions, nostalgia, pride, and something else. Something darker. I opened the door. The room looked almost exactly as I had left it. The desk, the chair, the filing cabinets along the wall. Even the old lamp in the corner. Someone had kept it intact. Maybe out of respect. Or maybe because no one else wanted it. I stepped inside and closed the door. For a moment, I just stood there. Then I placed my bag on the desk and sat down. The chair creaked slightly under my weight, as if greeting an old friend. I let out a slow breath and leaned back. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's see what you've done, Daniel." I reached for the computer. It took a moment to power on, the screen flickering before coming to life. The system was old, but reliable. Just like me. I entered my login details. To my surprise, they still worked. A small smile crossed my face. Some things never change. The desktop appeared, filled with folders and programs I hadn't touched in years. But I knew exactly where to go. I opened the database. Accessing it felt like slipping into an old habit. My fingers moved almost automatically, navigating through layers of information with ease. Names. Accounts. Transactions. At first, I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. But I knew I would recognize it when I saw it. Because patterns don't lie. And neither does money. I started with the house. Property records were easy to access. Within minutes, I pulled up the details. There it was. The transfer. Signed and finalized nearly a year ago. My signature stared back at me from the screen. Clean. Legal. Final. I felt a brief sting of anger, but I pushed it aside. Emotion clouds judgment. And right now, I needed clarity. I kept digging. Mortgage records. Loans. Financial activity tied to the property. And that's when things started to shift. There were loans taken against the house. Large ones. Far larger than anything Daniel could reasonably afford. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. "This doesn't make sense," I murmured. "Unless..." I clicked deeper into the records. The money wasn't just sitting in one place. It was moving. Transferred between accounts, split into smaller amounts, redirected through channels that felt intentional. Careful. Hidden. My pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus. This wasn't random. This wasn't panic. This was a pattern. And I knew that pattern. I had seen it before. Many times. People trying to cover their tracks. People who thought they were being clever. People who didn't realize how obvious it looked to someone like me. I opened another file. Then another. Each one revealing a little more. Each one tightening the knot in my chest. Daniel wasn't just in debt. He was buried in it. Credit cards maxed out. Business loans defaulted. Private lenders involved. My jaw tightened. Private lenders. That was never a good sign. Those weren't the kind of people who waited patiently for payments. Those were the kind of people who made problems disappear. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. "So that's it," I said quietly. "That's why they rushed. That's why they pushed me out. They weren't just being cruel. They were trying to survive. And in their desperation, they had chosen to sacrifice me." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Smart," I admitted. But not smart enough. Because they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I wouldn't look. They had assumed I wouldn't understand. They had assumed I was just an old man, out of the game. They forgot who I used to be. And more importantly, they forgot who I still was. I leaned forward again, my fingers moving faster now. I traced the transactions, mapping them out in my mind. Account to account. Name to name. Until something caught my attention. A transfer that didn't fit. It was small compared to the others, but it stood out because of where it went. I opened the account details. My eyes narrowed. "This," I whispered. "This is interesting." The accounts. I could hear him getting quieter as I spoke, more focused. By the time I finished, the silence on the other end felt heavy. Finally, he spoke. "Richard, this isn't just a financial mess. I know. This is illegal. I know that too." Another pause. Then, quietly, he asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked around the office, at the walls that had once defined my life. At the desk where I had uncovered truths that changed people's lives forever. Then I looked back at the screen. At my son's mistakes. At the consequences waiting to happen. And I made a decision. "I'm going to finish this," I said. "How far are you willing to go?" I didn't hesitate. All the way. Because this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about something deeper. Something final. They had thrown me out into the cold. They had taken everything they thought mattered. But what they didn't realize was that I was the one person who could take everything back. Not by force. Not by anger. But by truth. And truth is far more dangerous. I ended the call and placed the phone on the desk. Then I turned back to the screen. The night was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And somewhere across the city, in a warm house filled with false comfort, my family slept peacefully, unaware that by morning, everything they had built on lies was about to collapse. By the time the clock on the wall crept past midnight, the city outside had gone quiet, but inside that office, my world was getting louder. Not with sound, with truth. The kind of truth that doesn't knock politely. The kind that breaks the door down and forces you to see things exactly as they are. I sat at my desk, eyes fixed on the glowing screen, fingers moving slowly now, not because I was tired, but because I understood what I was looking at. And once you understand something like this, you don't rush it. You respect it. You study it. You let it reveal everything. The files in front of me were no longer just numbers and transfers. They were decisions, mistakes, desperation. They were my son's life, falling apart in real time. I leaned back slightly and rubbed my eyes. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel something human again. Daniel wasn't always like this. He wasn't always someone who hid things, who cut corners, who made dangerous choices. I remember teaching him how to ride a bike in the driveway. He must have been 7. He kept falling, scraping his knees, getting back up again. "I'm not giving up," he said, his small voice filled with determination. "You don't have to," I told him. "Just keep going." He did. And eventually, he learned. That was the boy I remembered. So how did that boy become this man? I turned back to the screen. Because somewhere between then and now, something had changed. And I was going to find out exactly what. I reopened the transaction logs and started mapping them again, this time slower, deeper. Every transfer had a purpose, even if it wasn't obvious at first glance. Money moved from the house equity loan into 3 separate accounts. From there, it split again. Smaller amounts. Less noticeable. Then redirected. Layer after layer. Classic laundering structure. Not perfect, but intentional. "Daniel," I muttered under my breath. "You didn't come up with this." No, this wasn't his work. Not entirely. Someone had shown him how to do this. Or worse. Someone had guided him. I zoomed in on one particular sequence of transactions, the one that had caught my attention earlier. It was These were shadow lenders. The kind that operate in gray areas. Or darker. I clicked through the report. There were no full names. No addresses. Just patterns. And those patterns matched exactly what I was seeing now. My son wasn't just in debt. He was entangled. And once you're in that kind of system, getting out isn't simple. I sat back and exhaled slowly. "So that's why," I said under my breath. "That's why they rushed. That's why they pushed me out without warning. It wasn't just about money. It was about risk. They knew something was coming. And they didn't want me there when it hit." For a brief moment, anger surfaced. Not loud. Not explosive. But deep. Controlled. They didn't just betray me. They used me. Used my trust. Used my name. Used my home. And when things started to collapse, they removed me from the picture like I was nothing. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the weight of that settle. Then I opened them again. Clear. Focused. Because feeling sorry for myself wouldn't change anything. Understanding would. I returned to the files and kept going. Each layer I uncovered led to another. Daniel had taken multiple loans, each one riskier than the last. At first, it was banks. Then private lenders. Then, these accounts. The pattern was clear. He kept trying to fix one problem by creating another. A cycle. A downward spiral. And at some point, he lost control. I found timestamps that told a story all on their own. Late-night transfers. Repeated attempts. Failed payments. Desperation. This wasn't greed. This was panic. And panic leads people to make dangerous choices. I stared at one particular entry. A large transfer. Recent. Very recent. Within the last 48 hours. I opened it. The money had been moved quickly, split, and redirected again. But this time, it didn't disappear completely. Part of it remained visible. Tracked. I followed the trail. And what I found made me sit up straight. This, I whispered. This is new. The account it led to wasn't hidden the same way. It was cleaner. More direct. And it connected to something official. Something real. I checked the details again, making sure I wasn't misreading it. But I wasn't. This account was under investigation. Already flagged. Already being watched. My heart began to beat just a little faster. Because this changed everything. Daniel hadn't just stepped into something dangerous. He had stepped into something already on the radar. Which meant it was only a matter of time. I leaned back and let that thought settle. Time. That's what this was about now. Timing. The system hadn't caught up yet. But it would. And when it did, it wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be controlled. It would be fast. And final. I stood up and walked over to the window. The city stretched out below, lights scattered across the darkness. Somewhere out there, my son was sleeping, believing he had solved his problem. Believing he had removed the one obstacle that might have complicated things. Me. I shook my head slowly. You never understood, I said quietly. Not about money. Not about risk. And definitely not about me. I turned back to the desk. Because now I had a choice. I could walk away. Leave it alone. Let the system handle it when it caught up. Or I could do what I had always done. Finish it. Expose it. Control the outcome. Older. Yes, but not gone, not finished, not forgotten. Because some skills don't fade, some instincts don't disappear, and some men don't break as easily as others expect. I saved the file. Then I finally picked up the phone. It was time. Not to react, not to argue, but to act. Because the truth was no longer hidden. And once the truth steps into the light, everything built on lies starts to fall apart. By morning, there would be no more secrets. Only consequences. By the time the clock reached 3 a.m., the world outside had gone completely still. No cars, no voices, no movement, just silence. But inside that office, nothing felt still. Everything felt like it was moving towards something inevitable. I sat at the desk, shoulders slightly tense, eyes fixed on the screen. The case file in front of me had grown into something solid. Not just scattered evidence. Not just suspicion. Proof. Clear, structured, undeniable proof. I scrolled slowly, reviewing every section again. Names, account numbers, timestamps, transaction paths. Each piece had its place. Each detail told part of the story. And together, they told the truth. I had done this countless times before in my career. Built cases from fragments. Turned confusion into clarity. Exposed things people worked hard to keep hidden. But this time felt different. Because this time, it was personal. I paused at a section that listed Daniel's accounts. I stared at his name for a long moment. Daniel Hale. My son. The boy who used to run through the house with muddy shoes, leaving footprints I pretended to be angry about. The young man who once told me, "I want to be just like you, Dad." I closed my eyes briefly. "You should have been better than me," I whispered. Because I had made mistakes in my life too. Plenty of them. But I had never crossed this line. I opened my eyes again. And just like that, the hesitation was gone. This wasn't about protecting him anymore. This was about stopping something that had already gone too far. I leaned forward and continued working. Every file had to be precise. Every detail had to be accurate. There was no room for error. Because once this was handed over, it wouldn't just affect Daniel. It would affect everyone connected to him. Melissa. The lenders. The network behind it. This wasn't just a family problem anymore. It was a legal one. A serious one. I opened a new section in the document and began outlining the timeline. It started with the property transfer. Then the loans. Then the escalation. Then the involvement of external accounts. Each step showed progression. Each step showed intent. And intent mattered. I typed carefully, choosing my words the way I always had, clear, direct, impossible to misinterpret. The more I wrote, the more everything aligned. This wasn't chaos. It was a chain reaction. And now, I was about to trigger the final link. I leaned back and glanced at the clock again. 3:47 a.m. Still time. But not much. I stood up and stretched slightly, feeling the stiffness in my back. Age doesn't disappear just because your mind is sharp. I walked over to the small cabinet in the corner and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected anger, or sadness, or something louder. But what I felt instead was calm, a deep, controlled calm. The kind that comes when a decision is already made. I returned to the desk and sat down again. The final step. Verification. answers. But only one mattered now. He made his choices, I said finally. Frank didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, he said, "All right." The call ended shortly after that. I placed the phone down gently. And just like that, it was out of my hands. Or at least, most of it. Because while the system would take over from here, there was still one more thing I needed to do. One final move. I turned back to the computer and opened a separate file. This one wasn't for the authorities. This one was for me. I began organizing a smaller, focused summary. Something simple. Something direct. Something that connected everything clearly. Because I knew how these situations worked. When things happened, they happened fast. People panicked. They lied. They tried to shift blame. But facts don't panic. Facts don't change. And I was making sure those facts were impossible to ignore. Time passed again, though it felt shorter now. More controlled. More purposeful. When I finally looked at the clock, it was 5:12 a.m. Morning was getting closer. The sky outside the window had shifted slightly. Still dark, but lighter at the edges. The world was about to wake up. And when it did, everything would be different. I stood up again and walked to the window. The city looked calm. Peaceful, unaware. I wondered what Daniel was doing at that moment. Sleeping? Restless? Did he feel it? That quiet sense that something wasn't right? Or did he believe everything was under control? I shook my head. It didn't matter. Because control was an illusion. And his was about to disappear. I returned to the desk and shut down the computer. The screen went dark, reflecting my face once more. Older. Tired. But steady. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. The office had served its purpose. Again. As I stepped into the hallway, the silence followed me. But it felt different now. Not heavy. Not uncertain. Resolved. I locked the office door behind me and made my way out of the building. The cold air hit me again as I stepped outside. But this time, I barely noticed it. Because the night was almost over. And morning was coming fast. I walked down the street slowly, not in a hurry. There was no need. Everything that needed to be done had been done. By the time I reached the corner, I heard it. Distant at first. Then clearer. Sirens. Faint. But growing. I stopped walking. Not because I needed to, but because I understood. It had started. Faster than I expected. I glanced at my watch. 6:03 a.m. Earlier than planned. Frank must have moved quickly. Or maybe the system had already been closer than anyone realized. Either way, there was no stopping it now. I turned slightly, looking in the direction of the sound. Somewhere across the city. Doors were about to be knocked on. Questions were about to be asked. Truths were about to be revealed. I stood there for a moment, letting the sound of the sirens settle into the morning air. And then, I started walking again. Not toward the house. Not yet. There was no need to rush. Because I already knew how this would end. At exactly 8:12 a.m., everything would fall into place, not by chance, not by luck, but by design, careful, precise, unavoidable. Because while they were sleeping in comfort, believing the worst had passed, the truth had been moving quietly through the system. Building. Connecting, waiting. And now, it was knocking. Loud, sharp. Final. By the time the sun fully rose over the city, nothing they had would belong to Not that I wanted to. Across the street, a neighbor stepped outside to pick up a newspaper. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away. To him, I was just another man standing in the cold. He had no idea what was about to happen. No one did. Not yet. I shifted my gaze back to the house. 8:10 a.m. 2 minutes. I noticed movement behind one of the windows. A shadow passing by. Someone awake. Probably Melissa. She always woke up early. I wondered what her morning routine looked like now. Coffee. Phone in hand. Maybe scrolling through messages, unaware that everything connected to her life was about to change. I wondered if she would remember the moment she told me to leave. If she would hear her own words echo back at her. Happy Thanksgiving. I tightened my jaw slightly. Not in anger. Just acknowledgement. 8:12 a.m. Right on time. The first knock came. Loud. Sharp. Unmistakable. Even from across the street, I heard it clearly. A second knock followed, harder than the first. Then a voice. Firm. Official. Open the door. Inside, everything shifted. I saw movement again, faster this time. Shadows crossing the walls, stopping, starting again. Confusion. Panic. The door opened. Daniel stood there, still in yesterday's clothes, his expression caught between sleep and sudden awareness. For a split second, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then it hit him. The officers stepped forward, their presence filling the doorway. I couldn't hear every word from where I stood, but I didn't need to. I had seen this before. Many times. The way people react when reality finally catches up to them. Denial first. Confusion. Then fear. Daniel stepped back instinctively, shaking his head. What is this? There's some kind of mistake. There's always a mistake. Until there isn't. More voices joined. Melissa appeared behind him, her face pale, her eyes wide. What's going on? She asked, her voice rising. The officers spoke calmly, professionally. Words like investigation, financial activity, accounts, property. Words that sounded distant at first. Until they didn't. Until they became real. I watched as the moment stretched, then broke. They stepped inside. And just like that, the house was no longer theirs. Minutes passed. Then more. A second vehicle arrived. Then another. The quiet street was no longer quiet. Neighbors began to notice. Doors opened. Curtains shifted. People stepped outside, drawn by the disruption. Whispers started. Questions. Speculation. I remained where I was, still and silent. Because this part wasn't about me anymore. Inside the house, everything was unraveling. I could see it in the way Daniel moved now, faster, sharper, his hands raised slightly as he spoke, trying to explain something that couldn't be explained away. Melissa stood near the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her posture defensive, as if she could protect herself from what was happening. But there was no protection from this. Not now. Not after everything had been set in motion. Time moved differently in moments like these. Slow. Heavy. Every second stretching longer than it should. Eventually, they were led outside. Daniel first. out of anger, but because of truth, because of choices, because actions have consequences, whether we're ready for them or not. Melissa stepped closer to him, her voice lower now, urgent. Daniel, fix this. Say something. But there was nothing to fix. Nothing to say. The system doesn't respond to panic. It responds to evidence. And the evidence was already in motion. More time passed. Eventually, the activity slowed. The officers began stepping back, their job done for now. But the impact remained. Heavy. Unavoidable. By noon, the house stood quiet again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was different. This one carried weight. Finality. The kind of silence that follows after everything has already fallen apart. I crossed the street slowly. Not in a hurry. Not with purpose. Just movement. Daniel stood near the edge of the driveway, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes distant. He looked up as I approached. For the first time in years. He didn't look like my son. He looked like someone who had lost something he didn't fully understand. Dad, he said again, his voice shaking now. Please. I didn't mean for this to happen. I stopped a few feet away from him. Close enough to see the details. The exhaustion. The fear. The regret. I know, I said calmly. Because I did. This wasn't part of his plan. But it was part of his choices. You have to help me, he continued, stepping forward slightly. You know people. You can fix this. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. The word landed heavier than anything else I could have said. His expression tightened. Why not? He asked, desperation rising. You're my father. I held his gaze. And you made your decisions, I replied. Not harsh. Not loud. Just true. Melissa stepped in then, her tone sharper. So that's it, she said. You just stand there and watch? I looked at her briefly. Then back at Daniel. I didn't do this, I said. And that was the truth. I didn't create the situation. I didn't force the choices. I only revealed what was already there. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, as if something inside him had finally given way. I was trying to fix things, he said quietly. I thought, if I could just get through it. I nodded once. I know. And I did. That was the tragedy of it. He wasn't trying to destroy everything. He was trying to save it. But he chose the wrong way. And the wrong way always costs more. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then I took a step back. Not away. Just back. Creating distance. The kind that can't be closed with words. You'll get through this, I said. Not as comfort, but as fact. People survive worse, but they don't come out the same. Daniel looked at me, searching for something more. But there wasn't anything more to give. Not now. Maybe not ever. I turned slightly, my attention drifting back to the house one last time. The place that had once been everything. Now just a reminder. Then I looked forward again. And I started walking. Not looking back. Not slowing down. Just moving forward. Because some endings don't need closure. They just need distance. That night, I checked into a quiet hotel on the edge of the city. Nothing special. Just a room. A bed. A place to sit and think. I placed my bag down and sat by the window, looking out at the lights in the distance. For the first time in a long while. Everything was quiet. No tension. No uncertainty. Just stillness.